a bridge, a man, a morning so still even the water forgot to move. He stood alone, not in fear, not in anger, just with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged. But stillness, for some, is unsettling. They watched him, questioned him, called for backup. Because when a black man doesn't flinch, doesn't hurry, doesn't explain, it makes people uncomfortable. They didn't know who he was, didn't ask, didn't care. But the man they nearly detained on that quiet bridge had once stood before Congress, shaping the very laws they claimed to uphold. And in that moment, they weren't just wrong. They were being watched, too. This is the stillness that changed everything. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? Tell us in the comments below. The bridge was quiet that morning, too quiet maybe, but Elijah had learned to cherish that kind of silence, the kind that wrapped itself around your shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy with memory, warm with repetition. The wooden planks beneath his shoes creaked softly with each step, as if acknowledging his presence without protest, and the mist rising off the lake ahead gave the whole scene a softness, a blurring at the edges like an old photograph, refusing to fade. He moved slowly, not from age, but from intention, as though every step he took was part of some long-forgotten ritual he was still faithful to, even if the world no longer remembered what it meant. The air was crisp, but not cold, the sky just beginning to trade its blue-black weight for something lighter, something that hinted at morning without yet committing to it. He adjusted the collar of his navy peacoat and paused midway across the bridge, setting his leather-bound journal on the rail beside him, his hands lingering a moment too long as if reluctant to let it go. He had been walking this same path for 15 years, ever since he and Naomi moved to the neighborhood after retiring from the city, and even after she passed, he never missed a day. "It's where I go to remember I'm still here," he once told his niece, who didn't fully understand, but nodded anyway, her eyes full of that careful sympathy younger people often give to grief they haven't yet earned. Today, though, something in the stillness felt taut. Not ominous, not yet, but expectant like the air, before a verdict or a room before the door opens. A single bird called from the tree line, high and sudden, slicing through the hush like a question with no answer, and Elijah let out a long breath, one hand resting on the rail, the other tucked into his coat pocket. The journal was old, its pages filled with a lifetime's worth of legal reflections, case notes, and half-finished letters to Naomi he would never send. Some mornings he wrote about constitutional philosophy or stare decisis. Other days he simply wrote about her, how she laughed with her whole body, or how she hated cantaloupe but never said no when he brought it home anyway. Today, though, he hadn't written a word yet. He was still thinking about what it meant to retire from the fight but still carry the scars. Thinking about how quiet dignity had become its own form of protest. A car passed in the distance, tires whispering against pavement too far to see close enough to notice. Elijah didn't turn to look. He knew the sound of engines like others knew birdsong. He could tell by the rhythm and rumble that it wasn't a neighbor's vehicle, probably a patrol, he thought, just making rounds. Still, his shoulders tensed a little. Not from fear, he had long since stopped being afraid, but from memory, from the reflex that comes when you've been taught again and again that stillness in the wrong place can look like defiance to the wrong eyes. He shifted his weight slightly, eyes fixed on the lake, and whispered to no one in particular, "Just another morning, Elijah, just breathe." And then came the crunch boots on gravel, deliberate, too close now to be casual. He didn't turn right away. He let the sound come to him, let it settle, allowed the moment to offer what it had before responding. When he finally looked over his shoulder, he saw a young white officer, tall, square-jawed posture, straight like he'd learned it from a brochure, making his way across the bridge with a notepad in one hand and the other hovering near his belt. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched. The officer slowed as he approached, eyes scanning Elijah from head to toe, hesitating just a beat before speaking. "Good morning, sir," he said, voice practiced, pleasant on the surface but edged with something tighter underneath. Elijah gave a polite nod but didn't speak. "Out for a walk," the officer added, stepping closer, now his boots loud on the wood. "I am, Elijah," replied his voice, even measured like someone who'd spent a lifetime using words with purpose. "Same walk I take every day." The officer nodded, looking past him, then back again. "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here so early?" Elijah's brow lifted not in anger, but in quiet disbelief. Didn't realize there were hours attached to walking. The officer smiled, a tight, polite thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No offense, sir, just doing my job. Got a call earlier this week about some suspicious activity near the lake. Just making sure everything's okay." "And is it?" Elijah asked, calm but unwavering. "Well," the officer hesitated. "Depends. Mind showing me some ID?" There it was, the moment that changed everything, the turn in the weather, the drop in the stomach, that came not from what was said, but from how easily it was. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked at the officer, really looked at him as though trying to find something beneath the badge and the bravado that might still be human. Then he looked back at the lake, at the sky, just starting to brighten, at the journal resting beside him, and said quietly, "Do you believe a man has to prove who he is just to stand still?" The officer didn't answer, and in that silence Elijah knew the answer anyway. Officer Colin Mertz had been patrolling that stretch of suburban lakeside road for nearly 6 weeks, long enough to memorize every mailbox, every garden gnome, every car that didn't quite belong, and yet not long enough to fully understand the difference between watchfulness and suspicion. That morning, as the fog lifted gently off the lake like a breath held too long, he drove slowly along the eastern loop, sipping weak gas station coffee and scanning the horizon with the over-alert energy of someone who hadn't yet learned what silence can teach you. He liked the early shift, the quiet, the control, the chance to catch things others might miss, and when his cruiser rounded the curve and the bridge came into view, he instinctively slowed, one hand resting on the gear shift, the other cradling his coffee like a habit. That's when he saw the man, a figure standing still in the middle of the bridge, not pacing, not loitering, just there, upright, deliberate, alone against the backdrop of pale light and slow-moving water. Colin didn't know yet why it bothered him, but it did. Something about the man's posture, the way he faced the lake instead of walking forward, struck him as odd. Not threatening exactly, but not typical either. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make out detail. Dark coat, tall frame, silver hair, maybe a notebook or something resting on the bridge rail beside him. Colin leaned forward, eyebrows narrowing. "What's he doing?" he muttered aloud, then caught himself annoyed at the habit of talking when no one was listening. He set the coffee in the holder, clicked his seatbelt release, and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Got a subject standing alone on Lakeview Bridge, black male, around 70, long coat, unknown behavior. Gonna check it out." He heard the faint crackle of a reply, "Copy that," and opened the door. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he stepped out, rolling his shoulders to shake off the chill. It wasn't cold, not really, but the fog had a way of sinking into your clothes if you stood too still, and he didn't like stillness. Stillness left too much room for thinking. He adjusted his vest, checked that his name tag was straight, and started walking toward the bridge, his right hand grazing the edge of his utility belt, not resting on anything specific but not far either. As he approached, he watched the man more closely. No sudden movements, no signs of distress, no phone out, no earbuds in, just standing there breathing in the morning like it belonged to him. Something about that struck a chord Colin didn't recognize, like a note slightly out of key. He called out when he was about 10 feet away, voice even loud enough to carry, but pitched like a neighbor asking a favor. "Morning, sir," he said. "Everything all right today?" The man turned slowly, calmly, with the kind of deliberate grace that comes from someone who's never rushed unless they chose to. His eyes met Colin's with a quiet steadiness, not defiant, not passive, just aware. "Everything's fine, officer," he said, his voice low and even. "Just walking?" Colin nodded, trying not to sound too eager. "Nice day for it. You live around here?" "I do," the man replied, offering nothing else. There was a pause, not long, but just long enough to feel it. Colin filled the silence the way young officers often do, with protocol dressed up as casual concern. "Had a few calls recently about some folks acting strange near the lake. Just doing a routine check." The man raised one eyebrow so slightly it might have been mistaken for a twitch. "Strange how—" Colin hesitated, then shrugged. "Can't say. Just, out of the ordinary." A small breath left the man's nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Seems to me ordinary depends on who's watching. Colin wasn't sure how to respond to that. He glanced down at the man's hands. No weapon, no phone, just fingers folded loosely in front of him, like someone about to recite a prayer or a verdict. "Mind if I ask for some ID?" he said, finally, tone still light, but leaning slightly more toward official. The man didn't move. "Am I being accused of something?" "No, sir," Colin replied quickly, "just part of standard procedure." The man looked back toward the lake, then returned his gaze to Colin. Funny how procedure shows up more often when the skin is darker than the fog. And there it was, that subtle, impossible weight, the kind that drops between two people without making a sound, the kind that can't be measured in body cam footage or report language, but presses just the same. Colin shifted his stance slightly, realizing he hadn't expected this to become a conversation. He was used to nods compliance, maybe a polite "thank you for your service" and a wave goodbye. But this man wasn't giving him that. He was giving him nothing he hadn't earned. From the cruiser, the radio chirped again, dispatch checking in, but Colin didn't answer. He stood there on the bridge, trying to read a man who offered no signs, no excuses, no reason to be questioned, except the fact that he had stayed still long enough to make someone nervous. Elijah turned back to the railing, gently touching the spine of his journal, his voice just above a whisper. "You're not the first to ask me to prove I belong here." Colin blinked, unsure whether that was meant as a warning or a gift. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, caught in the quiet unraveling of something he didn't yet understand, but already felt he'd lost control of. Elijah didn't speak right away, not because he didn't have something to say, but because he knew the weight of silence, knew how to let it do its work, before words were allowed to enter the room. He kept his gaze steady on the young officer standing just a few feet from him, reading the posture, the eyes, the slight shift in stance that betrayed a discomfort deeper than anything written in a training manual. The officer's fingers flexed near his duty belt, not on the weapon, not yet, but close enough for the air between them to tighten without warning. Elijah could feel it, the shift in the weather, the invisible line drawn not by action but by assumption, by the creeping calculus of control that had been practiced on men like him for generations. He'd felt this before, in airports, in elevators, in marble courtrooms where his voice carried more weight than his skin allowed, and yet here they were again. The bridge beneath them didn't move, but the moment swayed slightly like a branch bending under too much wind. Elijah straightened his shoulders, not out of defiance but clarity. "I'm going to ask you again, sir," the officer said, his voice a notch tighter. "Now, do you have identification on you?" Elijah turned toward him fully, this time resting one hand lightly on the bridge rail, the other still tucked in his coat pocket. "You already asked," he said calmly, "and I'm still deciding whether the question deserves an answer." His tone wasn't hostile, but it was unshakably firm, like granite smoothed over by years of storms. He wasn't trying to win the moment, he was trying to hold it still long enough for the truth to show itself. The officer blinked, taken aback by the calm, the lack of panic, the absence of fear. He was used to people explaining themselves, justifying their presence, apologizing for being noticed, but Elijah didn't give him any of that. What he gave was something older, something earned. "Sir, I'm not trying to cause any trouble," the officer said, shifting his weight again. "You just fit a description, that's all. We got a call earlier this week, someone loitering around the bridge, similar build, dark coat. That's it." Elijah raised an eyebrow, not dramatically, just enough to mark the moment. "So a man standing still becomes a suspect," he said, more to the sky than the officer. "Is that the new policy?" The officer opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "It's not personal. I'm just doing my job. Safety check." Elijah nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you the weather report even though you've already been rained on. "And what is it exactly that makes me unsafe?" he asked. "My coat, my skin, my stillness." There was no anger in his voice, but there was gravity, the kind that pulls truths out of the air whether you're ready to hear them or not. The officer swallowed, glanced back toward his cruiser, then looked again at Elijah, as if trying to gauge whether this conversation was above his rank. And maybe it was. A light wind moved across the lake, lifting the edge of Elijah's coat, and carrying the faint scent of pine, and something older like paper, or dust, or memory. Birds called out again, indifferent to the tension unfolding a few feet from their perch. Elijah watched them for a moment before returning his attention to the officer. You know, he said, I've argued cases in courtrooms where the burden of proof could decide the course of a life. I've stood before justices who knew how to ask better questions than the ones they started with. What you're asking me right now, it isn't about safety, it's about suspicion. And suspicion, officer, is a fragile thing to build authority on. The officer's jaw tightened just slightly. Look, he said, you can explain all that after we verify who you are. I'm not accusing you of anything. But if you keep refusing to cooperate, I might have to detain you until we sort it out. Elijah's hands didn't move, his voice didn't rise, but something in his stillness shifted subtly, unmistakably. Detain me, he said softly, for standing on a bridge. For not proving to you that I'm not dangerous. The officer cleared his throat. For not complying with a lawful order, he replied, trying to stay firm. If I let everyone walk away without confirming their identity, I wouldn't be doing my job. And what do you think your job is right now? Elijah asked, his voice like a thread pulled through cloth, slow, precise, revealing the pattern beneath. To keep this bridge safe from 70-year-old men with journals, or to remind the people in this town that presence can be punished if it isn't explained. A few seconds passed without sound. Even the birds seemed to have quieted, as if waiting for the next word to drop. The officer looked down at his feet, then back up again, and for a moment his eyes betrayed something deeper, a flicker of doubt, a question he hadn't expected to have to answer out loud. From across the lake, a dog barked, once sharp and distant, then fell quiet again. Somewhere behind them, a car door closed far off, but not forgotten. The town was waking up slowly, unaware that on a quiet wooden bridge a conversation was unraveling more than just protocol. Elijah exhaled through his nose and shifted his weight slightly, never breaking eye contact. You know what the problem is? He asked almost gently. It's not that you don't know who I am. It's that you don't think it matters unless I tell you. The officer didn't respond, not right away. He stepped back half an inch, not from threat, but from the weight of a moment that no longer belonged to him. Elijah turned slightly toward the lake again, brushing one fingertip across the spine of his journal. I've seen laws change overnight, he said, almost as an afterthought. But hearts, those take longer. And sometimes they don't change until someone stops asking for permission to just be. And in that quiet, with only the breeze moving and the bridge creaking beneath them, the officer radioed for backup, not because there was danger, but because control was slipping, and he didn't know what else to do. The quiet on the bridge was starting to thin, not because of noise, but because of something heavier, something you couldn't hear but could feel sitting in your chest like a stone. Elijah stood his ground, the morning air brushing against his coat, while the officer fidgeted in that space, between certainty and the slow realization that this moment was no longer under his control. The call for backup had been made, the words already out there, non-compliant elderly male. As if language could reduce a human being to an administrative checkbox, as if decades of dignity could be filed under pending verification. Elijah watched the officer with a look that wasn't angry but wasn't soft either. It was the gaze of a man who had spent his life watching power mistake itself for wisdom. Colin didn't step closer, but he didn't back away either. Instead, he stood just to the side, posture, stiff jaw, set like he was trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. The wind picked up gently and ruffled the edge of Elijah's journal, the pages fluttering like they wanted to speak for him. You ever ask yourself, Elijah said quietly, why some people get to walk without question and others are always walking under suspicion? The officer blinked, caught off guard by the tone, steady, deliberate, but laced with something deeper. I told you, he replied, trying to keep his voice level. We had a report, someone matching your description acting out of place. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his eyes not moving from the officer's face. Out of place, he repeated, as if weighing the phrase in his mouth before letting it go. Tell me something, son. What exactly does out of place look like to you? The officer shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment it was clear he didn't have an answer. He trusted enough to say aloud. That phrase, that flimsy veil of justification, hung in the space between them like smoke from a fire. Neither of them had lit, but one of them clearly carried the responsibility for. The lake behind them shimmered in the soft light, calm and indifferent, the surface smooth enough to reflect the shape of trees, the hint of movement, the tension between two people who had never met but had always been expected to play out a script written long before either of them stepped onto that bridge. Elijah let the silence linger a few seconds longer, then exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance not in retreat but in quiet recalibration. "You keep saying just procedure," he murmured, as though those words make it neutral. "But son, there's nothing neutral about suspicion when it's built on nothing more than presence." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first, and in that pause Elijah saw everything he needed to know, not about the man himself, but about the system that shaped him, trained him, sent him out into the world with a badge and a manual, but not enough understanding to recognize what dignity looks like when it doesn't come packaged with a uniform or a name tag. "I'm trying to de-escalate here," Colin finally said, his voice now holding the weight of both frustration and confusion. "But I need your cooperation. I don't want to detain you. I just want to verify your identity." "Why?" Elijah asked, his tone still calm, still low, but now edged with something undeniable. "Why do you need my name to make peace with this moment? Why does stillness feel like resistance when it comes from someone who looks like me?" He reached slowly into his coat, not suddenly, not aggressively, but with the care of a man who knew that every movement could be misread if the viewer had already written the ending. From his inner pocket he pulled out a handkerchief, unfolded it neatly, and wiped the edge of his glasses before slipping it back into place. The officer watched the motion, visibly tense, and Elijah noticed. "You were ready for something else, weren't you?" he said gently. "Something louder, something dangerous, something to match the story you were already telling yourself." Behind them, the sound of a car engine crept into the distance, low, deliberate signaling that backup was approaching. Colin didn't acknowledge it, but Elijah heard it and understood what it meant. The moment was about to get crowded. "You're escalating this," Elijah said, not accusingly, but plainly, like someone pointing out the weather. "And you're doing it because you can't reconcile calm with control. You see restraint and read it as defiance. But this isn't a standoff. This is a reckoning. This is a reckoning." Colin took a breath deep through his nose, as if trying to reset something within himself that had long been left untouched. "This is standard," he repeated, like someone hoping the words might offer a raft in rising water. Elijah looked at him, truly looked, then turned his eyes to the flag that hung limp on the post nearby, its fabric barely moving in the still air. "Standard," he echoed. "I've heard that before in courtrooms, in policy memos, in apologies that never meant to say sorry. You know what I've learned, officer? Standard's just another way to say comfortable for some, costly for others." The squad car crept into view, tires crunching softly against gravel, and the bridge seemed to inhale. Elijah didn't move, didn't shift, didn't offer anything but his presence. And in that stillness something spoke louder than raised voices ever could, a kind of patience that doesn't beg for understanding, a kind of composure, forged not from avoidance but from survival. "You think this ends when you get my name," he said, barely louder than the wind, "but names don't change narratives when the story's already been written in suspicion." Colin didn't respond. His shoulders squared as the other cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, and for the first time he looked unsure of what to do next. Elijah turned his head slightly, eyes following the birds overhead as they lifted from a branch and disappeared into the gray-blue sky, weightless, unbothered, free, in a way that felt painfully distant. And without raising his voice, without taking a step, Elijah simply said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The question is, are you?" The sound of gravel shifting beneath the cruiser's tires was subtle but undeniable, like a whisper that carries more meaning than a shout. And as the second patrol car pulled to a slow stop behind Officer Mertz's vehicle, Elijah didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't turn to greet the newcomer. He remained exactly where he was by the bridge rail, one hand resting lightly on the weathered wood, the other tucked inside his coat pocket, like it had found its own rhythm against the rising tension. The mist had begun to lift just enough to let the sun spill faintly through the trees, creating small flashes of light on the lake's surface, but none of that warmth seemed to reach the air between the two men. It stayed heavy, charged not with volume but with the thick, uncomfortable weight of what had been left unsaid for too long. The door of the second cruiser opened with a mechanical thunk, and out stepped a younger officer, slim-build, short-cropped blonde hair face, still too new to carry the shadows of the job. He closed the door gently, not slamming it, not rushing like someone who understood instinctively that volume could spark what silence had kept at bay. Elijah turned only slightly, offering the new arrival a glance, then returning his gaze to the water as if to say, "I see you, but you don't own this moment." Officer Mertz cleared his throat, the kind of reflexive sound people make when they're not sure what happens next, and gestured toward Elijah with a nod. "That's the subject," he said flatly, his voice stripped of context, his language reduced to labels. Subject. The word landed hard in the space between them, not because it was loud, but because of what it carried. An echo of case files, incident reports, mugshots, pinned to bulletin boards, bodies reduced to descriptions before anyone bothers to ask a name. Elijah didn't react. He didn't need to. The silence was doing its job. The new officer, perhaps sensing the strain already thick in the air, approached slowly, his palms visible, his voice cautious but not unkind. "Good morning, sir. We got a call from my partner. Just need to verify your identity if you don't mind." Elijah looked at him, really looked, and saw a flicker of discomfort behind the polite tone, a hesitation that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with conscience. "I do mind," Elijah said calmly, "but I imagine that doesn't change your next move." The officer opened his mouth to reply, but Elijah raised a hand not to interrupt but to give the moment room to breathe. "Let me ask you something," he continued. "Do you know why you're here?" The younger man blinked, uncertain. "To assist in a field identification," he said, but it came out more like a question than a statement. "No," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "You're here because your partner made a call, and your department trained you to follow that call before you question the foundation it's built on." The second officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing toward Mertz, who now stood with arms folded tightly across his chest, expression unreadable. "It's just policy, sir," the young man offered. Elijah smiled, but not with amusement. "That's what they always say. Policy, protocol, safety. But what they never ask is who wrote the policy and who pays the price when it's enforced without thought." The journal beside him caught a small breeze fluttering its edges like a whisper too insistent to ignore. Elijah reached out and closed it gently, his fingers moving with the care of someone who'd spent a lifetime tending to details most people missed. The act was simple, but in that moment it felt like a declaration. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, turning to face both officers now. "But I also won't participate in a process that begins with presumption and ends in humiliation." Officer Mertz took a step forward, voice firmer than before. "Sir, I've asked you twice now, and I'm asking you again. If you don't show identification, I may be forced to detain you." Elijah tilted his head the way someone might lean in to hear a faint melody more clearly. "Detain me for what?" he asked. "For walking, for not responding fast enough to your suspicion, for not matching your idea of what belonging looks like." His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was more power in the restraint than in any outburst. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of children laughing echoed faintly across the water, a reminder that life was continuing just out of reach, oblivious to the slow collision unfolding on this bridge. Elijah heard it, and it grounded him not because it offered escape, but because it reminded him why he had learned to remain composed, even when every part of him wanted to scream. He looked toward the trees lining the far end of the lake, remembering marches in the rain courtrooms thick with tension, and long nights when staying calm wasn't a choice but a necessity. He turned back to Mertz and said, "You don't know who I am, and that's fine. But the real issue isn't that you didn't know, it's that you didn't care to ask before deciding who I might be." The younger officer shifted again, glancing down as if the gravel at his feet might offer an easier truth. "Sir, do you have ID?" he asked, softer this time. Elijah reached into his coat, not quickly, not dramatically, and pulled out a small leather wallet worn at the corners, its edges smoothed by years of quiet use. He opened it slowly and held it at chest level, revealing not just a driver's license, but a folded federal identification card with a seal that glinted briefly in the morning light. The young officer leaned in slightly, and when he read the title he froze, not with panic but recognition. He looked up at Elijah, then over at Mertz, who took a step closer and asked, "What is it?" The younger man's voice dropped a little. "He's a federal attorney. Retired. High clearance." Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind that demands a reckoning. Elijah tucked the wallet back into his coat and said nothing more, because the point had already been made. Not in words, but in posture. Not in explanation, but in presence. He stood exactly where he had stood from the beginning, not for validation, not for vindication, but because that bridge that morning in that stillness, he had every right to be there. And now they knew it too. The sound of footsteps on the far end of the bridge broke the spell. Not loud, not rushed, just deliberate enough to be noticed. And as Elijah turned his head slightly, he saw a woman with a small tan dog on a red leash, pausing as she approached the unfolding scene. She was maybe in her mid-40s, wearing a gray hoodie and running shoes, her ponytail pulled through the back of a worn baseball cap, and her face was caught somewhere between concern and calculation. She didn't speak, but her eyes flicked between the two officers and Elijah, measuring the tension the way you might gauge a thunderstorm that hasn't yet broken. The dog sniffed the air once, then sat down at her feet, tail still. She remained where she was, hands loosely holding the leash like someone deciding whether to intervene or disappear. A jogger slowed down near the edge of the park path below, pretending to check his phone but angling himself so he could watch from a distance. A father near the playground, his child mid-climb on the jungle gym, stood a little straighter, one hand rising slightly toward his waist, not in fear, but in readiness. The kind of instinct that rises when you see something you've seen before, even if you've never lived it directly. The air didn't grow louder, but it shifted again, like the world around them had begun to hold its breath collectively. Elijah felt it before he saw it, an awareness, not of danger but of eyes, of presence, of witnesses. He didn't move. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew better than to surrender the gravity of that stillness. The years had taught him that power once confronted doesn't like to be looked in the eye while it flinches. He watched the officer's Mert's stiff jaw-flexing arms now firmly crossed like armor, the younger one fidgeting slightly unsure if he should speak again. Elijah could sense the unease beneath the badge, could feel the way the younger man's fingers curled and uncurled near the edge of his vest like a boy reaching for the hem of his coat in a storm. "People are watching," the younger officer said under his breath, not as a warning but almost as a confession. Elijah turned toward him not with challenge but with a measured gaze that landed softly but stayed heavy. "That's how change begins," he replied, voice steady, not for effect, but because that's how truth sounded when it didn't ask for permission. When people stop pretending they didn't see it. In the distance, a car rolled slowly to a stop near the edge of the lot, an old sedan, windows down, music low. A teenager sat behind the wheel, holding a phone up toward the scene, silent but clearly recording. The moment had widened now, not just in geography but in reach. Elijah didn't need to say anything more. The quiet resistance of his posture was saying everything. Stillness, after all, can be mistaken for surrender by those who've never had to weaponize it. But this wasn't about yielding. This was about refusing to disappear. The dog barked once, a sharp staccato sound that startled no one but seemed to announce something inevitable. The woman at the edge of the bridge stepped a few paces closer. Now her face pulled tight with a mixture of empathy and outrage she hadn't yet decided how to express. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice clear-cutting through the silence like a chisel to glass. Officer Mertz turned his head, his voice quick and clipped. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," but she didn't back away. Elijah gave her a slight nod, not asking for help, not dismissing it either, just acknowledging her choice to remain. She stayed. The jogger looked up from his phone. The father near the playground moved closer, his child now sitting cross-legged watching quietly, and the teenager in the car held the camera steady. Elijah took all of this in, not with pride but with quiet recognition, as if seeing the arc of something long begun finally bending in real time. He turned back to the officers, his voice calm but edged with something unmistakable. "You can try to control this moment," he said, "but you don't own it. Not anymore. This isn't just about me and you. It's about the people who are tired of seeing this story play out like a rerun, always with the same script and the same ending." Mertz's face tightened, but he didn't speak. The younger officer looked like he wanted to say something, but the words hadn't formed yet. Elijah bent slightly and picked up his journal, brushing a bit of dust from the cover. He didn't open it, he just held it in both hands like a weight he had chosen to carry rather than drop. You know, he said more to the morning than to anyone in particular. I used to believe the law was the final word in a disagreement. That if you built the system with enough logic, enough equity, it would correct itself when it leaned too far. But I've lived long enough to know laws don't fix what hearts refuse to see. A breeze stirred the leaves above them, a soft rustle passing through the trees like applause, too gentle to be heard but too constant to be ignored. Elijah looked once more toward the lake, then back at the officers. "The difference today is simple," he said. "I'm not standing here alone. You're not just being watched, you're being remembered." The woman with the dog stepped even closer, now only a few yards from the line that had formed between presence and authority. Her dog sat obediently, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. And with that, Elijah didn't move forward. He didn't need to. He had already arrived. The sun had fully risen now, though its warmth hadn't yet chased the morning chill from the wooden slats beneath Elijah's feet, and as he stood between two officers, a woman with a dog, and a growing handful of silent observers, he knew the moment had reached its hinge point, the quiet breath before something irreversible was said or done. The younger officer shifted again, unease spreading across his face like ink in water, and his eyes darted once more to the badge in Elijah's hand, still partially tucked inside his coat. "May I see that again, sir?" he asked, this time with a tone that had lost its edge, replaced now by something closer to caution than command. Elijah held it up without a word, his fingers steady, his posture unchanged, letting the weight of it settle into the space between them. The officer stepped forward carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness, as if sensing that what he was about to learn might not just change his understanding of the situation, but unravel his role in it. He leaned in slightly, reading the words printed in small, blocky type on the Department of Justice credential, his lips moving silently as he traced the line that named Elijah Ware, retired senior federal litigator, clearance level 5, judiciary liaison. An identity not merely professional but foundational. The breath caught briefly in his throat, and when he looked up again, his eyes met Elijah's not with challenge but with realization. "Oh," he said barely above a whisper. "You're—" Elijah gave a slow nod, not triumphant, not smug, just patient. "Yes," he replied, voice even. "That's who I am." Behind them, Officer Mertz narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, his voice clipped. "What is it?" The younger officer turned toward him, holding out the credential without flourish. "He's a federal attorney, retired, high clearance." He didn't finish the sentence because there wasn't much more to say that wouldn't make the moment worse. Silence pooled between them, deeper, now heavier than any command or code could justify. Elijah returned the badge to the inside pocket of his coat, the movement smooth and unrushed, as if to signal that nothing had changed except everyone else's understanding. "The real question," he said softly, "is why it took credentials for my presence to be acceptable. What about the men who don't carry laminated proof? What happens to them?" The younger officer looked down, shame rising in his face like a slow tide, and even Mertz, still postured defensively, had no rebuttal ready. The woman with the dog stepped slightly forward, her face etched with something like disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, not to Elijah, but to the officers. "You stopped him over a coat and a notebook." Mertz's eyes snapped toward her. "Ma'am, we're conducting an investigation. You're not involved." But his voice had already lost its force. It sounded mechanical, now stripped of certainty, and it floated hollow into the morning air. The woman shook her head. "No," she said, "you're not investigating. You're reacting. And you did it because of what he looks like, not what he did." Elijah didn't respond to her, not directly. Instead, he turned toward the lake once more, his breath slow, his shoulders relaxed but firm. He'd lived through enough hearings, depositions, closed-door meetings, and late-night drafting sessions to know the exact moment when a room realizes it got something terribly wrong, and this was that moment. You could feel it in the silence. You could see it in the way the air seemed to press closer around their bodies, as if demanding an answer to a question no one had wanted to ask out loud. "You see," Elijah began, his voice low but not diminished, "I spent my career working to ensure that systems were in place to protect people, to give them the benefit of the doubt before the weight of authority came crashing down. And yet here we are standing on a bridge where the only crime I committed was not explaining myself fast enough. He looked at Mertz directly now. "You were ready to cuff me. For standing still, for making you uncomfortable." Mertz's face twitched like a muscle had been pulled too tight for too long and now was finally fraying. The teenager in the car, still recording, zoomed in slowly. The father by the playground had moved closer, arms crossed, his child now sitting quietly beside him. The woman with the dog took out her phone. No one was shouting, no one was moving fast. But the power had shifted. The moment no longer belonged to the badge, it belonged to the truth. And Elijah didn't need to raise his voice to make it heard. "I'm not angry," he said, almost to himself. "I'm just tired. Tired of a country that demands our silence, then punishes us for the sound of our presence. Tired of respect only being granted once status is confirmed. Tired of dignity being treated as conditional." The younger officer opened his mouth, then closed it. Then finally found his voice. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." Elijah looked at him with an expression both weary and kind. "That's the problem," he said. "You didn't think it was worth knowing." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the birds above seemed to still, as if listening. Then Elijah stepped back toward the edge of the bridge, placing both hands on the railing, his back to the officers now, not out of disrespect but because he had said what needed saying. The rest was theirs to carry. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of realization, the kind that doesn't crash down in a single moment but unfolds slowly like light spilling into a dark room 1 inch at a time. Elijah remained where he was, hands resting lightly on the bridge rail, eyes on the water that had carried every reflection without judgment, every shadow without question. Behind him, neither officer moved right away, as if their bodies had frozen in the same suspension that gripped the morning itself. The sound of traffic in the distance began to trickle back into awareness. The rustle of leaves overhead resumed its gentle rhythm, and yet the air around that bridge still carried a charge that no breeze could wash away. People had begun to drift closer now, not in a crowd but in quiet presence, curious, cautious, compelled. A woman walking her dog paused on the trailhead bench. A man with earbuds pulled one out. An elderly couple on their morning stroll had stopped a dozen paces away, whispering low to one another but watching all the same. No one said a word, yet everything about the atmosphere felt louder, more deliberate, as if the town itself had chosen to bear witness. Elijah could feel it, not just the eyes, but the weight of something larger gathering in the stillness. There is a kind of silence that doesn't ask to be broken, it demands to be understood. And that was the silence now hanging over the lake, the kind that wasn't born from confusion, but from the unsettling certainty that what had happened here mattered even if no one yet had the right language for it. Officer Mertz shifted slightly, his boots scraping against the wooden planks, a sound that might have gone unnoticed on any other morning, but here felt like a misstep in a sanctuary. The younger officer glanced again at Elijah, his posture softer, now his face somewhere between apology and awe, like a student, realizing too late that he's been reading the wrong book all semester. "I didn't mean for it to go this way," the younger one said, finally, his voice low, careful. "I really didn't." Elijah turned toward him, not with anger, but with something more difficult, honesty. "That's the thing about meaning," he replied. "It doesn't always protect us from consequence, or others from harm." The officer nodded, eyes lowering, as if retreating into some internal file where he hoped to find a different answer. But there wasn't one. Not now. Elijah exhaled a breath that had been waiting to leave since the first demand for ID, and he took a slow step forward, not toward either officer, but toward the edge of the bridge, where the morning light was beginning to warm the top of the water. His body moved without urgency, but with intention, like someone stepping back into his own rightful space after being pushed too far from it. He wasn't reclaiming it. He had never surrendered it to begin with. Across the lake, the wind had picked up just enough to send ripples gliding across the surface, small patterns dancing under the sun, unbothered by the human tension above. Elijah rested one hand on the rail and let his fingers tap against the wood, steady, rhythmical, like a man who'd written laws in silence and watched them distorted in practice. He thought of every hearing where his name had been read aloud with reverence, every courtroom where judges had leaned in when he spoke. And now here he stood, reduced to a suspicion, a vague description, a question mark. in the eyes of men with badges. Behind him, the teenager in the sedan was still filming, his camera steady, capturing not just what was happening but what wasn't, the restraint, the dignity, the refusal to fall into the trap of making the scene louder than it needed to be. Elijah had taught himself long ago that justice wasn't always about reaction. Sometimes it was about standing in the truth without asking it to scream. The woman with the dog had sat down now, her leash wrapped twice around her wrist, her eyes fixed on Elijah with the kind of quiet solidarity that didn't need explaining. She didn't look away when he glanced in her direction. She simply nodded a small gesture that said, "I saw it too." "You know," Elijah said, a loud voice, carrying just enough to reach the officers without forcing anything, "I spent my whole career writing protections into law, hoping they'd hold strong when they mattered most. But the truth is, laws can't breathe life into a system if the people inside it don't believe in what they're enforcing." The younger officer took a small step back, eyes down again. Mert's arms still crossed, opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. He just stared at Elijah, at the lake, at the journal still resting near the rail, as though trying to piece together how this all unraveled, without a raised voice, without a single broken rule. A distant horn honked from the road behind the trees, and somewhere nearby a bell rang faintly, maybe a school starting its day, or maybe just the hour shifting like the scene before them had crossed into a new chapter. Elijah adjusted the collar of his coat, not from cold but from instinct, a motion that felt more like a reset than a reaction. He wasn't tired, not exactly, but he was reminded again of the cost of being visible in a country that still didn't know how to look without suspicion. He turned toward the officers one last time, his voice quieter, now almost tender. "It's not about me. Not anymore. It's about what you do next." And with that, he picked up his journal, tucked it beneath his arm, and walked slowly toward the far side of the bridge, not rushing, not waiting, just moving forward, exactly as he always had. By the time Elijah reached the end of the bridge, the sun had risen high enough to cast sharp light across the path, illuminating every crack in the wood, every shadowed corner, every onlooker who had silently borne witness to what had unfolded. He didn't look back, not because he was finished with the moment, but because he understood that what needed to happen had already begun, and it no longer required his presence to continue. His footsteps on the gravel beyond the bridge were steady, his journal still tucked under one arm, the weight of it familiar and grounding, a quiet reminder that truth didn't always roar, it could simply remain. Behind him, no one followed, no commands were called, and no one dared raise their voice to stop him. The story had changed hands. The video, 38 seconds long, grainy, recorded from a teenager's dashboard phone, hit social media before Elijah even reached his front porch. There was no commentary, no caption, just the simple title, "Man Stopped on Bridge for Existing." The clip began with Elijah standing still, arms by his side, two officers in frame, one noticeably tense, the other visibly uncertain. It ended with a zoom in on the federal credentials held in his hand, followed by a single quiet line. "What about the ones who don't carry badges?" The internet didn't need drama to amplify it. The silence did the work. The stillness said what outrage often couldn't. Plank's fashion seed. Within hours, the clip had spread across platforms, not because it was shocking, but because it was heartbreakingly familiar. Comments flooded in, some angry, some stunned, many exhausted. "My father," one wrote, "was stopped just like this in Alabama." But he didn't have the words Elijah had. Another read, "I've been Officer Mertz. I've looked without seeing, and I need to do better." And then came the stories. Dozens. Hundreds. People sharing their own moments on bridges, sidewalks, parking lots, anywhere. Presence was treated like suspicion, and dignity had to be proven before it was acknowledged. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't even know the video had been posted until his goddaughter Grace called late that afternoon, her voice tight with something between fury and pride. "You've gone viral," she said, "and not for any of the reasons you should have." Elijah had paused mid-step in his kitchen, the tea kettle hissing quietly behind him, and offered only a soft, "Is that so?" Grace didn't let up. "They want you on the news. They're reaching out. CNN, NPR, even someone from a late-night show." Elijah poured his tea calmly, then turned to the window. "I didn't speak to be heard," he said. "I stood still to be understood." Meanwhile, the local police department released a statement, a careful, neutral piece of language that said everything and nothing at once. We are aware of the video circulating regarding an interaction between officers and a community member. The department is committed to reviewing the incident and reinforcing our dedication to respectful community engagement. They didn't mention Elijah's name. They didn't acknowledge his credentials. They offered no apology, no correction, just a promise to look into it, as if the footage hadn't already made everything crystal clear. But the world outside their offices had already moved on. A law professor in Chicago assigned the video to her constitutional law class. A group of public defenders in Georgia held a roundtable using Elijah's Bridge as a case study on implicit bias and field authority. A pastor in Ohio played the clip during his Sunday sermon under the title, "The Stillness That Speaks." And in a courtroom in Detroit, a young black judge paused before reading a ruling and said, "We must remember, justice isn't only about verdicts, it's about who we believe deserves to be left in peace." Elijah didn't watch the news that night. Instead, he sat on his back porch, the twilight, pressing gently against the horizon, his journal open but blank in his lap. He sipped his tea slowly, the warmth soothing but not distracting. His eyes stayed on the tree line ahead, where a soft wind rustled the branches like a whisper moving from leaf to leaf. He wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about his father, about a different bridge, a different town, a different officer, and how quickly history repeated itself when no one bothered to listen the first time. That night, as the sky deepened and the cicadas took over the airwaves, Elijah received a letter slipped through his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with neat handwritten script. "I saw you. I saw how you didn't shrink, how you didn't explain yourself just to survive. I've spent years teaching my son how to be small in public, how not to scare people. But you showed me something I'd forgotten. Presence isn't a threat, it's a right." There was no signature, just those lines and a folded newspaper clipping of the viral moment printed in black and white. Elijah closed the letter, gently laid it across his journal, and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't seeking legacy, wasn't asking for parades or plaque. What he wanted, what he'd always wanted, was for the world to stop asking him to earn his peace. And now, without raising a fist or a voice, he'd managed to show them that the absence of aggression doesn't mean the absence of power. The next morning, when he returned to the bridge, it was empty. Still, just as he liked it. He walked its length slowly, the boards creaking softly underfoot, the same as before, the same as always. But something had changed, not in the structure but in the air. Not in the scenery but in the eyes of those who might cross paths with him next. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stay where you are, and let the world figure out what it missed while it was too busy watching for trouble to recognize truth. A week after the bridge encounter, the town moved with a strange rhythm, one foot still in the routine of ordinary days, the other hesitating in something less certain, less familiar. Elijah could feel it when he walked down Main Street to buy fruit from the market. The stares lasted longer, the greetings sounded more deliberate, and people who had once passed him without a glance now seemed unsure where to rest their eyes. It wasn't hostility, it was something softer, yet no less complicated recognition. The kind that didn't ask for a conversation but couldn't quite settle into silence either. The cashier at the corner store handed him change with both hands, now eyes flicking up with a mixture of respect and apology, like someone unsure whether they were allowed to speak the truth out loud. The bridge had become more than a crossing, it was now a reference point. Children on bikes would slow as they rode past, whispering to one another, unsure of the story but knowing it had weight. A group of high school students asked their teacher if they could use the video in a civics presentation. And on a nearby church's announcement board in large black letters beneath the sermon title, it simply read, "Stillness is a statement." Elijah didn't seek out these changes, but he noticed them, each one, a subtle recalibration of how presence, once questioned, had become a quiet force in the air. In the days that followed, letters began arriving not from news outlets, not from politicians, but from people. Handwritten, folded into envelopes with no return address, or typed out carefully by hands unfamiliar with keyboards, each message carried something heavier than opinion. They carried memory. A nurse from Portland wrote, "My father never got the chance to stand still. They assumed movement meant danger, and he paid the price." A retired teacher from Charleston said, "Watching you reminded me of my grandfather who once stood outside a courthouse with a sign that simply read, 'We are not the threat.'" These words didn't fill Elijah with pride, but with something quieter responsibility. Not the kind that demands action, but the kind that comes when you realize your story has begun to echo in someone else's priders. One afternoon, Grace came by with a laptop under her arm, a look on her face that blended concern with determined fire. "They've organized a march," she said, not asking for permission but announcing what already was. It started online. A local student union veterans, even the ACLU chapter is getting involved. They want to walk the bridge in silence, stand where you stood, retrace your steps. Elijah looked at her, then down at his cup of tea, steam curling softly into the air. "Do they need me there?" he asked. Grace sat beside him, voice steady. "They don't want a speaker, Uncle Eli. They want a symbol. But honestly, they already have one." That Sunday morning before the first group gathered at the base of the bridge, Elijah took his usual walk, not early enough to be unseen but not late enough to be part of the movement. He moved slowly, hands behind his back, watching as orange vests were handed out, water bottles stacked, and signs leaned gently against trees, with words like "Dignity has no ID" and "Presence is not permission." He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once at a young girl adjusting her mother's sign, then crossed the bridge, the way he always had, quietly, deliberately, without announcement. By noon, the line stretched far down the Park Road. Students in college hoodies, veterans in full dress, parents with children and elders who remembered protests that had started with fewer people and more risk. No one chanted. No one shouted. The only sound was the soft rhythm of shoes on wood, wind through leaves, and the occasional breath drawn deep to keep composure. They walked in pairs, sometimes alone but never without direction. Some carried journals like Elijah's Eliazep's. Others wore black coats in solidarity. One man simply held a folded piece of paper above his head. On it, in large black ink, it read, "We shouldn't need to prove we belong." Elijah watched from a bench near the Veterans Memorial, hidden in plain sight, his presence known only to a few. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there because history doesn't belong to headlines, it belongs to the people who carry it forward. A boy, no older than 9, passed by with his father and looked over toward him with wide eyes. "Is that him?" he whispered. His father didn't answer, just nodded slowly, hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Later that day, Grace returned to the house, face flushed from the sun, her hands still shaking slightly from emotion. "They kept coming," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "I thought maybe 100, maybe 2, but it had to be close to 1,000, some from out of state, and no one caused trouble. They just walked." Elijah smiled faintly, stirring the tea that had long since gone cold. "Sometimes silence is the most disciplined act of resistance," he said. "You can't twist silence. You can only listen to it or refuse to." That night, photos from the march began to circulate online, black and white images of rows of people crossing the bridge, some with hands in pockets, others holding signs, all of them shaped by the same quiet purpose. No one posed. No one preached. It wasn't a protest built to impress. It was something gentler but not softer, something that insisted on being seen without demanding spectacle. And in those images, Elijah noticed one thing above all else: no one stood alone. He returned to the bridge the next morning at sunrise, before the mist had burned off, before anyone could say they were watching. He stood where he had before placed his hand on the same rail and closed his eyes for a moment, not to relive it but to acknowledge it, not as a wound but as a mark of presence. And when he opened his eyes again, the sky was beginning to lighten, the air felt still and wide, and he knew something had shifted. Not because of who he was, but because others had learned to remain where they once would have disappeared. That evening the house was quiet, save for the gentle creak of old floorboards and the distant hum of a neighbor's television leaking through the open window. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, a small ceramic lamp casting a soft golden glow across the pages of a letter he hadn't yet opened. Outside, the street was still. Porch lights flickered like fireflies too stubborn to rest, and a warm breeze carried the faint scent of cut grass and coming rain. The world felt paused, not in grief, not in fear, but in something heavier reflection. He could feel it in the stillness of his own breath, in the weight of everything unsaid between moments like this. Grace stood by the sink, her arms crossed, shoulders tight, her body angled away from him but her presence fully in the room. She had been pacing earlier the way she did when the thoughts came faster than her mouth could handle, but now she stood frozen, quiet, contemplative, as if deciding whether what she needed to say would land with force or with care. "They've started changing the training manual," she said finally, voice even steady. "The Academy's adding a whole new module, real-time bias, scenarios, de-escalation reviews, even using your video as a case study." She didn't look at him, not yet. She stared at the steam rising from the mug in her hands the way people stare when they're trying to measure the space between progress and pain. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He let the words move through the room, first settling in the corners before drawing them close. "That won't fix it," he said softly, not dismissively, just real. Grace nodded, her jaw tightening just slightly. "I know," she replied. "But it tells the next recruit that stillness isn't defiance. That presence doesn't need permission." Her voice caught at the end of the sentence like truth had snagged on the edge of her conviction. Elijah folded the unopened letter once, then laid it beside his cup. "That matters," he said, eyes still on the table. "It may not be the answer, but it's not nothing." They sat like that for a while, uncertain whether to fill the silence or let it hold them. The air between them wasn't tense, but it was thick with something unspoken, a mixture of pride and sadness of generations circling each other across time. Grace had always admired his calm, his ability to move through the world, like someone who knew exactly when to speak and when to wait. But now, sitting across from him, she saw it differently, not as composure but as discipline, not as peace, but as a survival strategy worn into his bones like the creases of his hands. She stepped forward and sat across from him, fingers laced together, elbows on the table like she used to sit when she was a teenager, and needed advice she wasn't ready to ask for. "Why didn't you tell them who you were right away?" she asked, not accusingly, but with a kind of ache in her voice, like someone asking why the ocean doesn't fight the wind. Elijah looked up slowly, meeting her gaze with eyes that had long since traded sharpness for clarity. "Because they already decided what I wasn't," he said. "And nothing I said would have reached them until they were ready to listen." Grace leaned back, her brow furrowing, trying to find comfort in a truth that refused to soften. "But you could have avoided it, avoided all of it." Elijah shook his head gently. "Avoiding it wouldn't have changed what caused it. It just would have made it quieter." He paused, the memory of the bridge still fresh in his chest, not as trauma but as testimony. Sometimes silence doesn't come from weakness. Sometimes it's the only language power doesn't know how to twist. The rain finally arrived, gentle at first, tapping against the windows like fingers, trying to remind them the world still turns. Elijah turned toward the sound, watching the drops collect and race toward the corners. Grace followed his gaze, then spoke again, more quietly now. "There are people calling for you to speak, to lead something. They're asking if you'll give a statement." Elijah gave a soft smile, the kind that held both warmth and distance. "The statement's already been made," he said. "Not by press release or podium, but by staying exactly where I had the right to be." He stood slowly, placing his mug in the sink, with the kind of care reserved for objects that have lived long in a house that's seen too much. Grace remained at the table, watching him not with expectation but with a newfound understanding of what it had cost him all these years to walk into rooms with his back straight and his voice measured. "You know," she said, "there's this student at the law clinic, first year, nervous, always second-guessing herself, but after she saw the video she told me, that's what I want to be, that sure, that unshaken." Elijah didn't turn around. He simply nodded, once hand on the kitchen doorframe, looking out into the night. "Then maybe it worked," he said. "Maybe that's enough." And for a moment neither of them said another word. The house held the stillness like a truth too sacred to rush. Rain whispered against the roof, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once, then stopped. Grace stood across the room and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. because in that moment everything that mattered had already been said. By the time the days had folded into weeks, and the sharpness of headlines softened into memory, Elijah returned to the bridge, not because he needed closure, but because places like people remember. The morning air was still the kind that carried the scent of dew-soaked wood and hinted gently at autumn with every cool breath. His steps were measured not out of caution but out of reverence, like walking through a place that had once tested him and now quietly bore witness to what had been endured. The sky above was brushed with a soft gray clouds, pulled thin and slow across the horizon, as if even the weather had learned the value of restraint. He stopped at the center where he had once stood so still that the world was forced to notice him, and placed his hand gently on the wooden railing, fingers spread wide, as if feeling for something deeper beneath the grain. The bridge hadn't changed, not in structure, but its meaning had been rewritten in the collective memory of a town that now knew how silence could sound louder than sirens. Below, the water moved easily, unhurried, holding the weight of sky and wind without protest, reminding him that some things like dignity don't need to declare themselves to exist. A teacher walked by with a group of students trailing behind their small voices, hushed as they approached the newly installed plaque near the foot of the bridge. No name, no date, no need for explanation. Just 10 words carved into brushed steel. He stood still so others could move forward freely. One of the children, no more than 10, read the words aloud slowly, his voice soft but clear. And for a brief moment Elijah saw himself through that boy's eyes, not as a man who had endured scrutiny, but as someone who had shifted something, quietly and without ceremony. He didn't turn to face them. He didn't need to. It was enough to know they had paused, that they had noticed, that they understood something had happened here worth remembering. He remained there a while longer, watching a leaf twist through the air, before settling on the surface of the lake, where it floated without resistance, carried by a current it would never have to understand. He smiled faintly, not with pride, but with peace, a kind of stillness that no longer needed to defend itself. Later that afternoon, as the sun tilted west and painted the treetops with amber light, Elijah returned home and sat on his front porch, a blanket draped across his knees and a notebook open in his lap. He wasn't writing speeches or memoirs. He was writing names, quiet names, ones no one had asked him to remember, but he'd never forgotten. People who'd stood still before there were cameras, people who didn't walk away, people who had paid the price for being seen before the world was ready to look. He paused often, not because he ran out of names, but because each one deserved to be written slowly with care. Grace stopped by just before dusk, holding a small brown envelope in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. She handed them to him without speaking and sat beside him, her body relaxed now in a way it hadn't been in weeks. The envelope contained a letter from a civil rights archive, requesting permission to preserve the video, the story, and the original journal entry he had carried on the bridge that day. The newspaper held a headline that didn't scream, it simply said, "One man's stillness changed the way we listen." Elijah chuckled quietly, the sound more breath than voice, and handed it back to her. "They always make it sound cleaner than it was," he said. Grace smiled. "That's why I keep the real version in my heart." As evening wrapped the neighborhood in shadow porch, lights clicked on one by one, casting halos across sidewalks, and the sound of laughter drifted from somewhere down the street. Elijah leaned back in his chair, eyes on the stars beginning to pierce the sky, and exhaled a breath that felt years long. "I don't want to be remembered because of what they almost did to me," he said quietly. "I want to be remembered for not moving when the world expected me to shrink." Grace nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will be." He stayed there long after she left, listening to the quiet rhythm of the night, the creak of wood, the wind in the trees, the occasional chirp of a restless bird. He didn't need ceremony. He didn't need closure. What he had found was something far more lasting: recognition that asked for nothing but presence and understanding that arrived without applause. And when a boy came by the next morning on his way to school, pausing at the base of the steps to call out, "Are you the man from the bridge?" Elijah simply smiled, leaned forward and replied, "I'm someone who stayed where he was supposed to be." The boy grinned, satisfied, and ran off down the sidewalk, his backpack bouncing behind him like a heartbeat in motion. Because legacy isn't built in moments of noise, it's shaped in the spaces where the world grows quiet and listens. And in the end, Elijah had taught a town, a generation, maybe even a country that real strength doesn't always arrive with sirens or slogans. Sometimes it shows up as stillness and stays. What Elijah's story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see history repeat, is that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. It lives in the quiet strength of standing your ground, in the calm refusal to explain your right to exist, and in the deep knowing that presence in itself is power. For many of us, watching this isn't just a story, it's a mirror. A reminder that we've seen these moments before, that some of us have lived them, and that true change doesn't come from spectacle. It comes from people who choose to remain visible even when the world turns away. This story isn't just about Elijah, it's about all of us. About the choices we make when no one's looking. About whether we choose silence that protects comfort or silence that challenges injustice. And it's about legacy, the kind that doesn't ask to be remembered but leaves something behind anyway. So if this story spoke to something deep inside you, if it reminded you of who you are, or who you've had to be, we ask you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that speak truth without shouting. Because the world doesn't just need more noise, it needs more clarity, more compassion, and more stillness that refuses to disappear. Thank you for being here. You matter. Your presence matters. And never let anyone make you feel otherwise.